World War II was marked by numerous significant battles. The bloodiest occurred on the Eastern Front. Each of these battles deserves to be immortalized in world history. However, only two of them constitute a turning point in the war, as they contributed to the strategic initiative shifting from the aggressor forces to the Soviet army. These are the battles of Stalingrad and Kursk. The Nazi offensive in Stalingrad was made possible by the defeat of Soviet forces in the Battle of Kharkov in May 1942. By the fall of Sevastopol on July 4, 1942, after a heroic 250-day defense, and by the loss of most of Uranus and the Donbass in July 1942. The waterways of the Volga and the oil fields of the Caucasus and Transcaucasia were at risk of being captured. On July 28th, the People's Commissar for Defense issued Order Number 227, Not a Step Back, which aimed to suppress cowardice and desertion. It was read out to all soldiers of the Red Army. This severe order played an important role as it fostered an awareness of the grave danger to the state and resonated with the internal feelings of the people. The loss of Stalingrad would have been equivalent to a technical defeat in the war. On July 17th, the Battle of Stalingrad began, often pushing Soviet soldiers to the limits of human capabilities. At the start of the battle, the Stalingrad front numbered 107,000 men, 360 tanks, 337 aircraft, and 7,900 guns and mortars. They were opposed by the German 6th Army, comprised of 18 well-equipped divisions. In August and September, they were reinforced by the Italian 8th Army and the Romanian 3rd Army. The ratio of forces was favorable to the enemy, 1.2 to 1 for men, 2 to 1 for tanks, and 3.6 to 1 for aircraft. On September 13th, the attack on the city began and lasted more than 2 months. The German attack was repelled by the troops of the Southeast and Stalingrad fronts, under the unified command of Colonel General Andrei Yeremenko. Stalingrad became a synonym for the mass heroism of the soldiers and the fortitude of the Soviet people. The brunt of the fighting fell on the armies led by Chukov, Shumilov, and Opatin, the divisions of Rodimtsev and Ludnikov, and the entire population of the heroic city, as every street, every house, and every factory turned into a battlefield. German aircraft subjected the city to barbaric bombings, reducing it to a heap of rubble. The defensive operation in Stalingrad cost the lives of 324,000 Soviet soldiers. Medical losses were slightly lower. German generals recalled the battle for the city as an indescribable battle that became a symbol of the struggle between two hostile worlds. By mid-November, the Germans' offensive capabilities had been completely exhausted, and they moved to the defensive. The idea of a counter-offensive in Stalingrad emerged almost from the beginning of the enemy's attack on the city. The goal was to weaken the enemy through active defense and then launch powerful strikes on the flanks of the enemy group, which would drastically change the strategic situation in the south of the country. The plan was codenamed Uranus and was meticulously developed in September and October of 1942. The operation was prepared in secrecy from the enemy. The offensive was conducted by troops of the newly created Southwestern Front, commanded by Lieutenant General Nikolai Vatutin. The Don Front, formed by renaming the former Stalingrad Front, Lieutenant General Konstantin Rokossovsky, and the newly created Stalingrad Front, under the command of Colonel General Andrei Yeremenko, with the assistance of the Volga Military Flotilla, Rear Admiral Dmitry Rogachev. Command over preparations for the counter-offensive on the southwestern and Don fronts was entrusted to Army General Georgy Zhukov, and on the Stalingrad front to Colonel General Alexander Vasilevsky. At the start of the operation, Soviet forces numbered more than 1.1 million men, 15,000 artillery pieces and mortars, over 1,500 tanks and self-propelled guns, and more than 1,900 combat aircraft. They faced German, Romanian, and Italian forces from Army Group B, which numbered more than 1 million men, approximately 10,300 artillery pieces and mortars, 675 tanks and assault guns, and over 1,200 combat aircraft. On November 19, 1942, Soviet forces launched their counter-offensive. On November 22nd, tank units from the Stalingrad and southwestern fronts linked up near the town of Kalachna-Donu and closed the encirclement, entrapping 22 enemy divisions, more than 330,000 men. On December 12th, the German command, attempting to relieve their forces that had been surrounded, launched Operation Wintergewitter, Winter Storm. But German tank divisions from Army Group Hoth, part of Army Group Don, were quickly halted at the Mishkova River and subsequently defeated. On January 10th, Operation Ring began and culminated in the defeat and capture of the surrounded forces on February 2nd, 1943. A day earlier, Moscow radio reported the capture of Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, commander of the 6th Army. In total, the enemy lost a quarter of its forces operating on the Eastern Front in the Battle of Stalingrad. 22 German divisions and 149 separate units were defeated, and more than 91,000 men were captured, including 24 generals. The successful conclusion of the Stalingrad operation was marked by the conferral of the title of Marshal of the Soviet Union upon the notable military leaders Zhukov and Vasilevsky. On March 6, 1943, the title of Marshal was conferred upon Stalin. The victory at Stalingrad had been reinforced by the overall offensive of the Soviet troops. The enemy had been forced to withdraw from the North Caucasus. Millions of Soviets and a vast territory, potentially rich in grain, coal, and oil, had been liberated from occupation. The partial lifting of the siege of Leningrad, which was achieved on January 18, 1943, after 7 days of combat, was of enormous importance. During the first half of 1943, the cities of Rzhev, Vyazma, Rostov-on-Don, Shakhty, and many others were liberated. On February 8, 1943, Soviet troops liberated the city of Kursk, which soon caught everyone's attention due to the battle that marked a turning point in the Great Patriotic War. British historian Alan Taylor wrote, "The Russian victory at Stalingrad, to a much greater extent than the defense of Moscow a year earlier, dispelled the myth of Germany's invincibility. Hitler himself said to Yodel, 'The god of war has changed sides.'" Indeed, the Battle of Stalingrad was one of the largest battles of World War II. It marked a turning point, not only in the Great Patriotic War, but in the entirety of World War II. During the battle, the adversary lost a quarter of its forces operating on the Soviet-German front. Total enemy losses in terms of those killed, wounded, captured, or missing amounted to approximately 1.5 million, which led Germany to declare national mourning for the first time in the war. Red Army losses reached approximately 1.13 million people, of which roughly 480,000 were irrecoverable. The strategic initiative passed firmly and definitively into the hands of the Soviet High Command, creating the conditions for the Red Army to launch a general offensive and expel the invaders en masse from occupied Soviet territory. The victory at Stalingrad elevated the international prestige of the Soviet Union and strengthened the anti-Hitler coalition. The defeat of the Wehrmacht in the Battle of Stalingrad undermined the position of German foreign policy and shook the confidence of its satellites. Japan became convinced of the futility of initiating military action against the USSR. By summer 1943, the front had stabilized. Both sides were preparing for the summer campaign. Since April, the German command had been developing Operation Citadel in hopes of achieving success quickly and completely. The plan was to destroy the forces of the Central and Voronezh fronts, defending the Kursk salient, and then develop the offensive towards Moscow. Operation Citadel involved the most combat-ready troops, a total of 50 divisions, a large number of independent units from the 9th and 2nd Field Armies of Army Group Center, the 4th Panzer Army, and Army Detachment Kempf of Army Group South. They were supported from the air by the German 4th and 6th Air Fleets. In total, the German troop grouping numbered over 900,000 men, approximately 100,000 artillery pieces and mortars, 2,700 tanks and assault guns, and more than 2,000 aircraft. The German command placed particular hope on the use of new combat equipment: Tiger and Panther tanks, Ferdinand assault guns, Focke-Wulf fighters, and Henschel attack aircraft, among others. This time, the Soviet command promptly uncovered the enemy's plan and developed a counter-strategy designed to first wear it down in defensive battles and then launch a counter-offensive. Important information regarding the planned Operation Citadel was received from the United Kingdom. In July 1939, British cryptographers deciphered the German Enigma encryption machine used on the Eastern Front. The deciphered Enigma allowed for surveillance of Operation Citadel starting from April 15. Intelligence from the London-based spy ring known as the Cambridge Five also played an important role. John Cairncross, one of the five, reported the positioning of 17 German airfields in that direction on the eve of the Battle of Kursk. Soviet aircraft destroyed 500 aircraft on these airfields. The High Command assigned the task of repelling the enemy offensive from Orel to the troops of Rokossovsky's Central Front, and from Belgorod to General Vatutin's Voronezh Front. Strategic reserves were positioned in the rear of the Central and Voronezh fronts and united into the Steppe Front under Colonel General Ivan Konev, with the mission of preventing an enemy advance and intensifying the attack from within enemy lines should Soviet forces launch a counteroffensive. At the beginning of the Battle of Kursk, the fronts included more than 1.9 million men, over 26,500 guns and mortars, more than 4,900 tanks and self-propelled guns, and approximately 2,900 aircraft. Soviet troops outnumbered the opposing enemy grouping at Kursk by a factor of 2.1 in personnel, 2.65 in artillery, 1.8 in tanks and self-propelled guns, and 1.4 in aircraft. On July 5, 1943, German forces launched an offensive aimed at encircling the Soviet units in the Kursk area. German soldiers captured the day before testified that the offensive was scheduled for 4 a.m. and that the soldiers had already received schnapps and 5 days' rations. This allowed them to confirm the start of the offensive, which had been repeatedly postponed. The front commanders ordered preemptive artillery counter-preparations. The enemy managed to penetrate the Soviet defenses in some areas by up to 10 to 35 kilometers. On the northern flank of the Kursk salient, on July 7th, the Germans advanced to the village of Ponery, which, as a German participant in the events observed, became the Stalingrad of the Battle of Kursk. A fierce battle took place there between the shock units of 3 German panzer divisions and the Soviet forces of Lieutenant General Alexei Rodin's 2nd Tank Army and Lieutenant General Nikolai Pukhov's 13th Army. Having lost up to 50,000 men and approximately 400 tanks, the enemy was forced to halt their advance. On the southern flank of the Kursk salient, the battle culminated on the 7th day of the German offensive. At dawn of July 12th, Combat erupted in a field measuring approximately 7 by 5 kilometers in the Voronezh front area, near the village of Prokhorovka. Around 1,200 Soviet and German tanks and self-propelled guns clashed in a head-on combat. This unprecedented battle lasted for 18 hours and ceased well after midnight. The wreckage of 300 German tanks out of the 400 that took part in the offensive remained on the battlefield. Among them were 70 new Tiger tanks. Soviet troops lost 500 of their 800 tanks in this battle. The battle did not end in a single day, although German losses were such that a decisive breakthrough was no longer possible. Even so, over the next 3 days, they advanced towards Prokhorovka, but failed to breach the enemy lines or outflank them. The omnipotence of the Wehrmacht on the battlefield had come to an end. The Germans were forced to withdraw the elite Totenkopf Panzer Division from the front line. Heinrich Hoth's Panzer Army lost half of its personnel and vehicles. The Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army, under the command of Lieutenant General Pavel Rotmistrov, 2 tank corps, and the infantry of Lieutenant General Alexei Zhadov's 5th Guards Army, suffered heavy casualties. On July 15th, Operation Citadel was abandoned, and the Germans went on the defensive. The commander of Army Group South, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, and his staff believed that the Soviet side no longer had the forces for active operations. This was a mistake. Zhukov and Vasilevsky had already begun implementing the second part of the plan. On July 12th, troops from the Bryansk and Central Fronts and part of the Western Front launched an offensive against the enemy grouping in Oryol, Operation Kutuzov, the first major result of which was the liberation of Oryol. On August 3rd, the Belgorod-Kharkov offensive, Operation Rumantsev, began. Belgorod was liberated on August 5th and Kharkov on August 23rd. On August 5th, for the first time in the war, Moscow fired an 122-gun salute in honor of the liberation of Oryol and Belgorod. The Battle of Kursk was one of the largest battles of World War II. More than 4 million men, over 69,000 artillery pieces and mortars, more than 13,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, and approximately 12,000 aircraft were involved on both sides. At Kursk, the German command's plans to turn the tide of the war in their favor were ultimately thwarted. The Battle of Kursk led to an even greater shift in the balance of power on the front line in favor of the USSR armed forces, definitively securing their strategic initiative and creating favorable conditions for the launch of a general offensive. The defeat of the enemy at Kursk was a crucial step in achieving a fundamental turning point in the war. Germany and its allies were ultimately forced to adopt a defensive posture in all theatres of World War II. The defeat of major Wehrmacht forces on the Soviet-German front created favourable conditions for the deployment of American and British troops to Italy, accompanied by the beginning of the collapse of the fascist bloc, as Italy, fighting on Germany's side, withdrew from the war. The victories of the Red Army spurred the growth of the resistance movement in Nazi-occupied countries. During the Battle of Kursk, Soviet troops defeated 30 enemy divisions, including 7 panzer divisions, inflicting losses of approximately 500,000 men, 3,000 artillery pieces and mortars, over 1,500 tanks and assault guns, and more than 3,700 aircraft. Soviet losses totaled over 863,000 men, including more than 254,000 irrecoverable casualties, over 5,200 artillery pieces and mortars, over 6,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, and more than 1,600 combat aircraft. The Soviet side had the capacity to replace the relatively large losses of its troops and consolidate its superiority. After liberating Oryol, Belgorod, and Kharkov, Soviet troops launched a strategic offensive along a 2,000-kilometer front. The turning point in the war, which began at Stalingrad, culminated in the Battle of the Dnieper. On November 6th, the capital of Ukraine was liberated. Several regions of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic left bank Ukraine, and the Donbass were liberated from the enemy, and bridgeheads were captured near Novorossiysk, Malaya Zemlya, and in Crimea, on the northeastern outskirts of Kerch and south of the city. From November 1942 to December 1943, 46.2% of the previously captured Soviet territory was liberated. And if the territory liberated before November 1941 is included, this figure was 53%. Nearly 46 million people lived there before the war. Following the Soviet victory in the Battle of Kursk, US President Franklin Roosevelt said, "If things in Russia continue as they are now, it is possible that a second front will not be necessary next spring." The reorganization of the rear services onto a war footing by mid-1942 was an important factor in the radical shift of the war on the Soviet-German front. Almost all industrial sectors were redirected toward military production, while civilian manufacturing declined drastically. Between 1941 and 1942, more than 2,500 enterprises were evacuated to the east of the country and relaunched. The Urals and other eastern regions became the main base of the military economy. The heroic efforts of the local population and those evacuated to these regions produced 3/4 of all military equipment, weapons, and ammunition. Despite the hardships of the war, 3,500 new industrial enterprises were built, and 7,500 were restored between June 1941 and January 1946. In 1944 and early 1945, gross industrial output exceeded pre-war levels, and military production tripled. In the military economy, the USSR achieved complete superiority over Germany. Its highly centralized system of economic management demonstrated its advantages in wartime. The USSR produced 5 times more tanks and weapons per 1,000 tons of steel than Germany. Even though it generally had lower industrial potential than the Third Reich and the countries working for it, the USSR began producing significantly more tanks, aircraft, and other types of weaponry starting in late 1942. By 1945, the labor intensity of manufacturing a T-34 tank had decreased by a factor of 2.4 compared with pre-war levels, while labor productivity in tank manufacturing had doubled. The quality of Soviet military equipment, Yakovlev and Lavochkin fighters, Ilyushin attack aircraft, Tupolev, Polikarpov and Petlyakov bombers, Koshkin, Morozov and Kotin medium and heavy tankers, and Grabin, Petrov and Ivanov artillery was superior to that of the German army. The losses in the first months of the war revealed a severe shortage of small arms, as well as artillery and mortars. By 1942, this shortage had been eliminated. The Tula and Izhevsk armed factories supplied 4 million rifles to the troops and mastered the production of Shpagin submachine guns, renowned for their reliability. During the war, Soviet industry produced 1,515,900 machine guns of all types, 12,139,900 rifles and carbines, and 6,173,900 submachine guns. To combat tanks, new models of anti-tank rifles designed by Degtyarev and Smirnov were produced. Civilian sector enterprises met the need for ammunition, with women handling most of its production. During this period, ammunition production increased to such an extent that the weight of a mortar salvo, which had been 548 kilograms in 1941, rose to 1,589 kilograms by December 1944. By 1942, the industry had met the Army's demand for mortars and mastered the mass production of the Katyusha multiple rocket launcher system, which was particularly menacing to the enemy. Aircraft manufacturing, especially in the Volga region, and tank production expanded rapidly. In late 1941, the Kirov plant, evacuated from Leningrad, was relocated to the site of the Chelyabinsk tractor plant, where a massive tank production complex, Tankograd, was established. The evacuated Komintern plant from Kharkov was incorporated into Uralvagonzavod in Nizhny Tagil, where heavy and medium tanks were built. The famous T-34 tanks were also produced at Uralmash and the Krasnaya Sormova shipyard in Gorky. During the war, the Urals supplied the front lines with over 70% of all combat vehicles. The main industries and enterprises of the military economy were skillfully run by talented and determined production managers. Women constituted a significant portion of the workforce in the economy. By 1945, they accounted for up to 60% of the total number of factory and administrative workers and up to 70% of agricultural workers. Furthermore, hundreds of thousands of teenagers and the elderly worked in factories and on collective farms. Patriotism and the conviction in the justice of their cause helped them to get through those terrible times. On the first day of the war, 136,000 construction workers who were building fortified areas on the western border were captured or killed. Nevertheless, thanks to the joint efforts of construction workers and military personnel, over 50,000 kilometers of fortified lines were erected in the first 2 years of the war alone. The volume of work, labor, and material expenditures on these projects far exceeded all hydraulic engineering projects from the previous 2 decades of Soviet rule. Losses in industry and agriculture led to a reduction in the manufacturing of consumer goods. A significant portion of production was directed toward supplying clothing and food to the front lines. In early 1942, the USSR adopted a rationing system for the supply of bread, meat, fats, and other essential foods, as well as essential manufactured goods, to the population. The first and highest category, a daily bread ration of 0.8 to 1.2 kilograms, was designated for workers and employees in the defense, coal, oil, and chemical industries, as well as construction and transport workers. The second category, averaging 0.5 kilograms of bread, was allocated to workers in other sectors of industry and the national economy. Residents of frontline cities faced particular hardships. In besieged Leningrad, food rations were cut 5-fold between September and November 1941. In July, Leningrad workers received 800 grams of bread. From November 20th, it dropped to 250 grams, while employees, dependents, and children received 125 grams each. From February 1942, the daily ration for Leningrad workers and engineering and technical personnel was increased again to 500 grams of bread. In the final days of the defense of Sevastopol, its population made do with an average of 200 to 300 grams of bread per day. The appearance of cities and citizens in the rear areas changed drastically. Routine repairs to buildings, sidewalks, and roads practically ceased at the beginning of the war. At night, the cities were plunged into total darkness. The number of beggars, panhandlers, and fortune tellers increased, especially in the bazaars. The number of religious believers grew sharply. The clothing of city dwellers lost all pretension to elegance, becoming more drab and of poorer quality. Most restaurants, cafes, and entertainment venues closed, but cinemas, theaters, cultural parks, and libraries remained open. Self-sufficiency in food production, particularly in vegetable gardening, became increasingly important. The number of vegetable gardens belonging to workers and employees increased by a factor of 3.5 during the war, and potato production in them increased 5-fold. Rural workers, already suffering greatly and often malnourished, operating under exceptionally difficult conditions, the mobilization of men to the front, the loss of the most productive grain regions, the reduction in the machine and tractor fleet and the horse population, as well as a severe lack of capital investment, struggled to supply the front lines in cities with food. Gross agricultural output in 1943, which was already marked by a drought, was only 37% of the 1940 level. Gross grain harvests at collective farms fell from 76.2 million tons in 1940 to 33.3 million in 1945. From 1941 to 1944, the USSR procured 4.264 billion pounds of grain, of which almost 83% was supplied by the peasantry. Even during the most difficult days of the war, the front lines and the cities were supplied with the essential minimum of food. All of this was crucial to the outcome of the war. In the wreath of the great victory, as novelist Mikhail Sholokhov figuratively put it, the golden ear of wheat is forever woven by the calloused hands of the peasants. Scientists made a significant contribution to the victory over fascism. Physicists laid the theoretical and experimental foundations for the design of new types of weapons. Mathematicians developed methods for faster calculations for artillery, aviation, and warships. Chemists discovered new methods for producing explosives, metal alloys, and pharmaceuticals. And biologists found additional food resources for the Red Army. Scientists contributed enormously to the mobilization of resources and the development of productive forces in the eastern regions. In particular, thanks to geological exploration, the development of the vast Volga-Ural oil and gas region began. Complex problems in achieving technical superiority over the enemy were also successfully resolved, neutralizing electromagnetic mines, creating new optical instruments using automatic electric welding, direct explosion technology, etc. The prominent Soviet scientists Bardin, Berg, Lagonravov, Vavilov, Kolmogorov, Lavrientsev, and Patton played an invaluable role in providing the army with the world's best weapons and military equipment. In 1942, Mikhail Kalashnikov manufactured his first submachine gun. Its subsequent development culminated in the creation of the famous AK-47. During the most difficult period of the war, the USSR began developing nuclear weapons. The US had been producing them since October 1939. Laboratory number 2 of the USSR Academy of Sciences was established in Moscow. Igor Kurchatov, a 39-year-old professor at the Leningrad Institute of Physics and Technology, was appointed scientific director of the atomic project. His brother Boris Kurchatov, Viktor Davydenko, and Georgy Flerov, as well as theoretical physicists Yuri Hariton, Yakov Zeldovich, Isaac Pomeranchuk, and others took their first steps towards success. Healthcare professionals made a significant contribution to the overall victory. Of those admitted to medical facilities during the war, 72% returned to duty, 8% died, and 20% were discharged from the army. The radical turnaround in the military situation in the USSR's favor revealed the stark differences in the spiritual potential of the aggressor and the victim. The Soviet side countered the misanthropic fascist ideology of racism and genocide against enslaved peoples with universal ideals such as national independence, solidarity, and friendship among peoples, justice, and humanism. Throughout the war, the Soviet ideology focused on strengthening patriotism and inter-ethnic unity among the peoples of the country. Citizens of all nationalities were conscripted into the Red Army and fought on the front lines for their common motherland. During the most difficult times, when the pre-war army had been essentially destroyed by the enemy and the Ukrainian and Belarusian lands were occupied, it became essential to make better use of the demographic potential of the non-Slavic peoples of the USSR. National military units were created largely due to the recruits' limited knowledge of Russian. The national republics of the eastern part of the USSR hosted and rebuilt evacuated enterprises and contributed to the common struggle. Strengthening the fraternal community of peoples was one of the main themes of propaganda. Socialist-class venues were replaced by the overarching concept of the motherland. That same year, work began on replacing the Internationale with a patriotic anthem that reflected the historical trajectory of the country's peoples, rather than the struggle of the international proletariat. From early 1944, official commemorative events and daily Soviet radio broadcasts began with the anthem of the unbreakable union of republics united by Great Russia. The anthem was based on the majestic music of Alexander Alexandrov, with its aspiration and call to heroism which was so crucial for a country at war. The military orders established in honor of Alexander Nevsky, Alexander Suvorov, Mikhail Kutuzov, and Bogdan Khmelnytsky, as well as the orders and medals of Fyodor Ushakov and Pavel Nakhimov, played an extremely inspiring role. The Red Army reintroduced the traditional Russian military uniform, featuring shoulder boards and officer insignia. The Suvorov and Nakhimov military schools were established and modeled after the old cadet corps. Propaganda efforts were organized in the front lines and in the rear, based on the directive to instill Soviet patriotism through examples from the Russian people's heroic past. In October 1944, the issue of officially permitting military personnel to wear the Cross of St. George, which had been awarded to soldiers during World War I, was discussed at the highest level. The government took increasingly rigorous measures to recognize the important role of the Church. In late March 1942, the first Council of Bishops of the Russian Orthodox Church during the war was convened in Uranus. The hierarchs who collaborated with the German occupation authorities were condemned during the meeting. The condemnation of traitors to the faith and the motherland inevitably reduced the overall scale of collaboration in the occupied territories. This condemnation contributed significantly to the fact that the majority of ordinary priests who found themselves under occupation remained loyal to their motherland, assisting the partisans and protecting civilians from Nazi repression. The patriotic activities of the priests were ruthlessly punished by the occupying forces, demonstrating a shift in attitude toward the Church. In April 1942, the Moscow authorities helped organize the religious celebration of Orthodox Easter for the first time. On November 2, 1942, one of the three highest hierarchs of the Russian Orthodox Church, Metropolitan Nikolai Boris Yaroshevich, was appointed to the Extraordinary State Commission for the establishment and investigation of the atrocities of the Nazi invaders. On January 5, 1943, Metropolitan Sergius sent a telegram to Stalin requesting permission for the Church to open a bank account to deposit funds designated for the defense effort. In response, Stalin gave his consent and thanked the Church for its efforts. The opening of the bank account signified the de facto recognition of the Church as a legal entity. Major changes in relations between the government and the Church occurred following Stalin's meeting with Metropolitans Sergius, Alexei, and Nikolai. The meeting was also attended by Vyacheslav Molotov and the NKVD department head Georgy Karpov, who was slated to become the future chairman of the Council for the Affairs of the Russian Orthodox Church under the USSR Council of Ministers. The meeting took place on September 4, 1943. During the meeting, a series of issues that needed to be resolved to normalize relations between the Church and the state in the USSR were outlined. Immediately after the meeting, the mansion previously occupied by the German ambassador was handed over to the Patriarchate. On September 8th, an episcopal council was convened to elect a patriarch, whose throne had been vacant since the death of Patriarch Tikhon. On September 12th, the council, composed of 19 hierarchs, 16 of whom were brought from concentration camps and exile, elected Metropolitan Sergius of Moscow as the new Patriarch of Moscow and all Russia. Love for the motherland, hatred of the enemy, faith in victory, patriotism, and the heroism of the Soviet people were the central themes of literature and art. Even before the war, Soviet literature, in the words of Alexei Tolstoy, was moving from the pathos of cosmopolitanism to the motherland. The war greatly intensified this trend in journalism and throughout all artistic culture. Almost in the very first hours of the war, the triumphant song The Sacred War emerged, set to the music by Grigory Alexandrov, with lyrics by Vasily Lebedev-Kumach, which became the anthem of the war years. In August 1941, Konstantin Simonov wrote the poem Wait for Me, which, like a prayer, was constantly recited by almost the entire population of the country. Works of Tolstoy appeared, touching the most cherished chords of the soul and revealing the Russian character. The poem Vasily Tyorkin by Alexander Tvardovsky became a huge hit. The creation and performance of Dmitri Shostakovich's Leningrad Symphony in besieged Leningrad was an act of true heroism. All of this, including the journalism of Mikhail Sholokhov and Ilya Ehrenberg, the lyrics of Alexei Surkov, the symphonies of Sergei Prokofiev, the songs of Boris Mokrousov and Vasily Solovyov-Sedoy, the performances of popular artists from frontline theaters such as Lydia Ruslanova, Leonid Utesov, and Klavdia Shulzhenko, the paintings of Alexander Gerasimov, Pavel Korin, and Alexander Dyneka, and many other notable cultural achievements of the war years, elevated the morale of Soviet citizens, fostered a sense of national pride, and strengthened their determination to win. The statement by historian Olga Zhukova perfectly characterizes the events of 1942 to 1943. A miracle truly happened during the war, but it lies in the incredible effort of millions of citizens at the front and on the home front who spared no effort. Where people drew the strength for such daily and constant heroism is an inexplicable question, the answer to which can be found in the socio-cultural sphere of life in a society at war. Figuratively speaking, socio-cultural policy is both the sublime poetry of the spirit and the most ordinary prose of life. And war is that extreme situation in which this poetry and this prose of life converge to help the ordinary worker of the war remain a civilized person in uncivilized and inhuman conditions. It was this incredible heroism of the entire people that not only thwarted Operation Barbarossa and confounded the pessimistic predictions of the Western powers, which had forecast that the USSR would resist Nazi Germany for no more than 6 weeks, but also brought about a radical turning point both on the Soviet front and throughout World War II. It was the victory of the Soviet army at Stalingrad and in the Battle of Kursk, and the selfless labor of Soviet citizens on the home front, many of whom were women, the elderly, and children, that marked the beginning of the just and merciless defeat of inhuman German Nazism.